I never thought a single careless sentence could alter the course of my life, or humanity's. Yet there I was, standing in the central hall of the Council Nexus aboard the alien cruiser Aurelia, realizing the magnitude of joke I had flung into the void without a second thought. "You'd make a cute wife," I said, half laughing, half testing the tension in the air. It had been meant as a flippant remark, a human attempt at levity in a room that reeked of rigid protocol. The alien queen paused mid-step, her form towering and fluid, shifting with a grace that defied physics as I knew it. Her head tilted, not in curiosity, but in a way that made the room's gravity seem irrelevant. Silence swallowed the chamber, thick and suffocating. Every advisor, every council member, every sentient being present held its breath, as if time itself had been suspended. "I accept," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air vibrate. The word struck me like a meteor. My brain scrambled for a rational response, a joke to diffuse attention. But no joke existed in the lexicon of interstellar politics that could match this moment. The room, vast and constructed from materials that reflected light in fractal patterns, suddenly felt impossibly small. My casual remark had become a decree in a civilization far older, far wiser, and far more complex than any human system I had ever encountered. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to vanish. Instead, I froze, feeling the inexorable gravity of the decision I had inadvertently invoked. Around me, the alien advisors shifted uneasily, their expressions unreadable yet undeniably judgmental. They spoke in a series of clicks and tones, too rapid for my comprehension, yet I understood enough in the cadence and the Queen's subtle nods that the room had pivoted entirely on my words. What does that mean?" I stammered, though my voice betrayed a hint of disbelief. "It means exactly what it sounds like," the Queen replied, her form stretching and contracting like liquid glass. "You have, by your human custom, expressed a willingness to enter union with me. According to our interstellar covenant, your statement is binding. It cannot be undone without severe consequences." The words hit me in layers I hadn't prepared for. Consequences. Severe consequences. For me, for humanity, for the fragile diplomatic bridge we have been building for decades. I tried to recall the briefings from Earth. The alien species, known as the Sarathians, were renowned for their meticulous honor codes, their unyielding adherence to tradition, and their ability to enforce compliance across star systems. A joke was not a joke here. A word was an action. I could see the thought forming in the minds of the other humans present. Diplomatic disaster. Political embarrassment. The headlines that would inevitably follow. But the truth, raw and unavoidable, was that I had no defense. The Queen had framed my human levity into a serious, binding act. "Ambassador," one of the human diplomats whispered, stepping cautiously toward me. "This we might need to clarify." "No," the Queen interjected, and the sound was more felt than heard, resonating through the chamber. "Clarification is unnecessary. The covenant is clear. Consent is expressed. Acceptance is complete." My stomach turned. The room, with its soaring ceilings and luminous walls, seemed to pulse in response to the tension, as though the structure itself recognized the magnitude of what had just transpired. I felt my heartbeat echoing in my ears, each pulse a drumbeat marking a point of no return. I tried to regain composure, to speak, to negotiate, but the Sarathian language of clicks and tonal shifts was beyond my grasp. Every movement I made, every syllable I attempted, felt clumsy and inadequate. I realized, almost instinctively, that no human argument could undo what I had unintentionally created. The Queen moved closer, her presence commanding but not threatening. She extended a hand, not in aggression but in acknowledgement. Her gaze, though alien and unreadable in structure, carried an unmistakable curiosity. "You may not understand the weight of your words," she said, "but you are already within the covenant's embrace. You may choose to resist, but know that resistance carries risks you cannot imagine." I swallowed hard, aware that resistance was not merely a matter of ego or fear. It was a potential spark for interstellar conflict, a breach in fragile diplomacy, a test of humanity's capacity for restraint. My mind raced through scenarios, each more improbable than the last. An attempted escape, a formal challenge to the Covenant, a miscommunication that could escalate into war. Yet beneath the fear, there was another emotion, something I hadn't expected, a flicker of curiosity. The Queen was not hostile. Her decision was deliberate, and in it, I sensed intelligence, depth, and even an unspoken invitation. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the being behind the authority, the consciousness capable of both exacting law and perceiving nuance. The advisors whisper among themselves. I caught fragments. Binding irreversible, human unaware, delicate protocol, the weight of the room pressed on me. Every motion, every decision, every thought I had would now carry consequences far beyond my immediate comprehension. I looked at her again. The Queen's form shimmered slightly, as if responding to the tension that now filled the chamber. The acknowledgement of my words had shifted the balance of power, not just between us, but between our species. I was no longer just a human observer. I was a participant, a factor in a larger game I barely understood. And then the realization hit me in full force. I could not walk away. Even if I ran, even if I pleaded, even if I invoked every human legal and diplomatic safeguard I could think of, the Covenant was binding. My fate was no longer solely my own. I started, but my voice faltered. I wanted to negotiate, to clarify, to make a joke that might retract the statement. But the Queen's gaze held me still. There was no escape in her eyes, only the quiet inevitability of what had been set into motion. The room seemed to tilt, the ceiling elongating, the walls shimmering with the light of distant stars reflected through the cruiser's hull. I realized, perhaps too late, that this moment would define the next chapter of not only my life, but the fragile relationship between Earth and the Sarathians. And then, as I opened my mouth to speak again, she said it once more, slower this time, as though letting the words sink into the depths of reality. I accept. The echoes of that phrase settled in my chest, heavy and permanent. I felt the ground of certainty shift beneath me. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, no simple explanation. A casual remark had irrevocably bound me to the alien Queen, and in that instant I understood. My life as I knew it had ended. The chamber fell silent. The advisors had frozen. The human diplomats stared in disbelief, and I stood, a solitary figure caught in the gravitational pull of decisions far larger than myself. A single truth burned through my mind. Everything had changed. The question now was not whether I could escape, but whether I would survive what came next. The next hours, or perhaps days. I could not tell. For the Sarathian concept of time was elastic, blurred into a haze of ceremonial precision and unspoken judgment. I was escorted through corridors that shimmered with iridescent light, each surface humming faintly with energy that was not electricity, but something older, almost alive. Every step was observed, calculated, and documented, not just by the Sarathians themselves, but by devices whose purpose I could only guess. I found myself in a hall of advisors, a chamber vast enough to make my lungs feel shallow. The walls displayed holographic records that shifted as if aware of my gaze. Maps of star systems, treaties spanning centuries, and portraits of figures I could only assume were past queens and consorts. Each image radiated authority, a visual reminder of the weight of history pressing down upon me. The advisors were waiting. They were not monstrous, not grotesque, not the caricature of alien imagination I had half expected. They were humanoid enough to appear familiar, yet their forms bore subtle differences. Elongated fingers tipped with translucent sheaths, eyes capable of reflecting not just light but thought, and skin that pulsed faintly in rhythm with what I guessed was their cardiovascular system. "Ambassador," one said, his voice a series of harmonious tones that my translator rendered into English. "You have entered a covenant with Queen Seralia. You do not yet comprehend its implications. We will explain." And they did. The Sarathian political system was intricate beyond any human model. The Queen was not an autocrat in the sense we understood. She was a central node of a web of councils, each with overlapping jurisdiction, each responsible for maintaining equilibrium between law, morality, and diplomacy. Every citizen, every visitor, every diplomat was subject to a lattice of regulations and traditions, some codified in texts, others etched into ritual and memory. Consent, they explained, was a linchpin of Sarathian law. Once expressed, verbally or symbolically, it was binding. To retract it lightly, or to argue that it had been a joke, was unthinkable. There were precedents, yes, but each had ended in exile, penance, or in extreme cases, termination, not just of the individual, but sometimes of entire delegations. I felt the weight of my words settle like a stone in my chest. Every moment I had joked, every casual human expression, had been magnified into cosmic significance. I was no longer merely a diplomat. I was a participant in a living system of governance that spanned galaxies, where a single human laugh could ripple through centuries of protocol. One advisor approached, extending a crystalline tablet. On it was a record, my statement, logged in multiple Sarathian dialects, time-stamped according to their hyperdimensional clocks, and annotated with commentary from legal, cultural, and emotional perspectives. It was a ledger, a declaration, and a warning all in one. You are aware, the advisor said, that to refuse now would be to endanger not only yourself but the fragile relations between your species and ours? Yes, I admitted, my voice hoarse. I wanted protest, but I realized the futility. I had already crossed the line. I had already been observed, assessed, and accepted. The Queen herself appeared then, moving through the hall with her signature fluid grace. She radiated authority, but beneath that authority was something subtler, expectation, patience, and a hint of curiosity. She approached me, placing a hand, shimmering, multifaceted, impossibly delicate, on my shoulder. You must understand, she said, that your species is young, impulsive. Your humor is a tool of survival, but it carries dangers here. Our laws are ancient, our covenants absolute. You have entered a world where your word is action. I swallowed, feeling both awe and fear. I had never been so small, so human, yet so pivotal. I realized that my actions, my thoughts, my very presence could be dissected for lessons in diplomacy, psychology, and interstellar law. Every misstep might ripple outward, imperceptibly at first, then catastrophically. The advisors led me to another chamber, the Council of 10, an assembly that resembled nothing in human governance. Each member radiated authority, but in a manner subtle and layered. The hum of their skin, the cadence of their speech, the minute adjustments of posture that spoke volumes. Here, I was formally introduced. Names, ranks, histories, all delivered with precision and expectation. You are to understand our customs, one counselor said, for only by understanding can you navigate the covenant you have entered. Queen Seralia expects your compliance, your judgment, and your intellect. Intellect. That word struck me more than authority, law, or danger. They did not seek blind obedience. They sought participation, reasoning, discernment. They expected me to think, to engage, to comprehend, and to act, not just as a human, but as an actor in a cosmic drama of ethics, diplomacy, and power. Over the following hours, the Council introduced me to the Sarathian concept of empathic accountability, a system where actions were weighed not only for their outcomes, but for their intentions and emotional resonance. My casual remark was assessed in light of not just law, but potential emotional consequences, cultural reverberations, and historical precedent. Every syllable, every gesture, every breath had meaning. I felt the moral conflict pressing against me. On one hand, I had been careless, a human misstep. On the other, I was now an ambassador not only of my own species, but of a bridge between worlds. Any resistance, any panic, any attempt to retract my words could be interpreted as duplicity or disrespect. And yet, to comply fully required a surrender of autonomy I had never known before. The Queen observed silently, her form constant yet subtly shifting, reflecting a thoughtfulness that humans could barely imagine. In her presence, I felt the enormity of her emotional depth, her intelligence, and the intricate balance she maintained between authority and empathy. She was not merely a ruler. She was a custodian of a civilization, and I had been thrust into her orbit. As I absorbed the lessons, the explanations, the warnings, I noticed subtle gestures from the Queen. A raised hand here, a nod there, the faintest flicker of a smile. It was almost imperceptible, but it suggested acknowledgement, perhaps approval, perhaps even amusement. I did not know which, and I feared misinterpreting. Yet, a small part of me, an irrepressible part, was drawn to the intelligence behind those gestures, the mind that could hold law, emotion, and curiosity in delicate balance. The chamber darkened slightly as the Cerathian sun shifted beyond the hull. I realized the day, or whatever segment of time it was, had passed in a blur of instruction, observation, and assessment. I had learned enough to understand the danger, the stakes, and the impossibility of escape, but I had not learned enough to predict the Queen's intentions or the consequences of my presence. And then came the announcement. A formal session of the Council would convene tomorrow to determine the practical terms of the covenant. I would be bound not only by words but by duties, expectations, and scrutiny at every level. The Council's decision could dictate my freedom, my survival, and potentially the fate of interstellar diplomacy. I was alone for a brief moment, staring at the chamber's shimmering walls. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. My casual remark had triggered a chain of events I could neither control nor escape. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears. But one truth remained clear. The world, or rather, the universe, I had known no longer existed. A final thought lingered as I prepared for the next day, a thought both terrifying and strangely compelling. In the midst of protocol, law, and cultural intricacy, there might be understanding, and perhaps even connection. The Queen's words, spoken earlier and echoing in my mind, resonated now with an intensity one could not ignore. You have entered our world, ambassador. You may not understand yet, but your journey has already begun. And with that, I realized the journey was no longer optional. The next cycle of days, or what the Cerathians measured as cycles, pushed me into a rhythm I had never imagined possible. The Council nexus became less a place of observation and more a crucible of interaction, debate, and unexpected intimacy. My role was no longer passive. I was a participant, a problem solver, and, most unervingly, a confidant to a queen whose intelligence and emotional complexity challenged everything I thought I knew about diplomacy, culture, and even myself. We began with governance exercises, simulations designed to test our understanding of law, ethics, and interstellar strategy. The exercises were deceptively simple in description. Respond to crises, allocate resources, mediate disputes. Yet the reality was labyrinthine. Each choice branched into scenarios I could not have anticipated, forcing me to consider not only immediate consequences, but far-reaching ripple effects across star systems and sentient populations. You think too narrowly, the Queen observed during the first simulation, her voice calm yet incisive. You prioritize human survival, comfort, and ego. Consider the balance of life beyond your species. What we ask is not obedience. It is comprehension. Her critique stung, not because I lacked intelligence, but because her perception of nuance and consequence was something I had never encountered. Humans, I realized, often acted on emotion first and rationality second. Cerathians acted with a symmetry of logic and empathy that rendered human impulsiveness almost comical, except when the stakes were lives, systems, and civilizations. As the exercises continued, our interactions deepened beyond instruction. I found myself analyzing not just the decisions, but the mind behind the decisions. The Queen's thought processes were elegant, deliberate, and morally intricate. She weighed variables that were invisible to me: cultural symbolism, emotional resonance, historical precedent, and potential diplomatic fallout. In her presence, I felt both inadequate and exhilarated. Then came the first ethical debate that pierced beyond theory into the personal. A colony on the edge of Cerathian space had petitioned for autonomy, citing historical grievances. The Council presented the case to us, asking for our joint recommendation. The human instinct was to sympathize, to advocate for freedom. The Queen's perspective was broader, balancing stability, tradition, and potential interstellar consequences. You favor emotion, she said quietly during our deliberation. It is human, but emotion alone cannot govern. I understand that, I countered, but without empathy, law becomes tyranny. She tilted her head, regarding me with a subtle intensity that left no room for pretense. Then perhaps the challenge is to find the intersection. Law guided by empathy, empathy constrained by law. Can your species do that? It was a question that lingered in my mind long after the session ended. I began to see her not just as a ruler, but as a partner in reasoning, a mind as rigorous and curious as my own. The more I engaged, the more I realized how complementary our strengths were. My human intuition, her Seraphian analytical depth. Together, we were navigating scenarios that neither of us could solve alone. Yet connection bred tension. Human colleagues whispered warnings. Don't trust her too much. Remember your position. This isn't a friendship. Even the advisors hinted at concern. A human entwined so closely with a queen could complicate diplomacy or ignite a scandal across multiple systems. And the opposition did emerge, precisely as predicted. A delegation from Earth challenged my presence in the Covenant, arguing that no human could be bound in such a way without explicit governmental approval. The Seraphians, predictably, countered with records of my verbal consent. Debate erupted not just on legality, but on symbolism, representation, and morality. Every argument I made was dissected, every hesitation noted, every inconsistency amplified. Meanwhile, within the council, I felt subtle scrutiny. Some Seraphian elite viewed me as an anomaly, a disruption to centuries of tradition. Their opinions were veiled in politeness, but the undertones of suspicion and judgment were unmistakable. I was a human in a Seraphian covenant, an unpredictable variable in a system designed for equilibrium. And yet, in the quiet moments, the Queen revealed glimpses of vulnerability, a subtle shift in her posture when discussing difficult decisions, a hesitation before addressing the council on morally charged matters, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps amusement, when I offered a solution that no Seraphian advisor had considered. One evening, after a long session on interstellar resource allocation, she spoke in a tone softer than I had ever heard. You are unlike any human I have encountered. You consider consequence, yes, but you also weigh moral nuance. It is rare. I swallowed, aware that my response carried more weight than casual acknowledgement. I am learning, I said. From you. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to linger, letting the words settle between us. There was no physical gesture, no cliché of intimacy. Yet in that quiet, something profound passed. Recognition, respect, and perhaps the beginnings of trust. The relationship that had begun as obligation began to shift. I found myself anticipating her perspective, analyzing her reasoning, and considering her values. My human colleagues noticed my distraction, but the Queen seemed to understand instinctively that my attention was not mere compliance. It was engagement, a meeting of minds that was as intellectual as it was emotional. Yet the deeper connection brought sharper risks. Opposing factions, both human and Seraphian, began to act. Earth officials attempted to negotiate alternate arrangements, proposing replacement envoys and legal appeals. Some council members questioned whether a human in a covenant could be impartial or even loyal. Tensions rose, debates sharpened, and the stakes multiplied. Every decision we made together could ignite conflict, force policy reversals, or destabilize fragile alliances. The challenge was no longer about survival. It was about alignment. Our cooperation required mutual respect, intellectual honesty, and ethical clarity. We could not merely perform. We had to reason, anticipate, and navigate morally and politically treacherous terrain. One late cycle. The Queen presented a scenario that forced the ultimate test of compatibility. A distant world faced a moral crisis. A population required intervention, yet intervention would violate Seraphian non-interference laws. We were tasked to propose a resolution. My instincts clashed with Seraphian law. Her perspective balanced preservation and precedent. The discussion was heated, precise, and exhausting. We debated ethics, sovereignty, and long-term consequences for hours, dissecting every possible outcome. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Your reasoning is sound. You think like a Seraphian, yet you retain your humanity. That combination is dangerous and valuable." Dangerous, valuable. The words lingered in my mind, unsettling and exhilarating at once. I realized that I was no longer just an ambassador or a consort by circumstance. I was becoming a partner, intellectually, morally, and perhaps, in ways I could not yet name, emotionally. By the end of the cycle, we had reached a resolution for the crisis, one that satisfied law, ethics, and practical necessity. Yet the outcome was secondary. What mattered was what had emerged between us. A mutual recognition of competence, integrity, and respect, a connection built not on sentiment, but on shared intellect and moral alignment. And in that recognition came an unspoken understanding. Whatever path lay ahead, opposition, political upheaval, or cosmic responsibility, we were now bound together, not only by covenant but by choice. The partnership was genuine, earned through thought, reasoning, and confrontation. It was no longer imposed. It was mutual. I realized then that this journey was not just about survival, diplomacy, or morality. It was about understanding, trust, and the quiet formation of a bond that might transcend culture, species, and expectation. And as I stood beside her, watching the council deliberate, I felt a clarity I had never known. The covenant had become real, and so had the connection it had inadvertently forged. The question now was not whether I would comply. It was how far I was willing to go, what sacrifices I would make, and whether humanity could navigate the consequences of my choices alongside the alien queen. I was learning to understand, respect, and, perhaps, in ways I dared not admit, care for. The day of the covenant's formalization arrived with a weight that pressed down on the corridors, the council chambers, and on me personally. I had rehearsed countless arguments, anticipated every objection, and mentally prepared for every diplomatic contingency. Yet none of that preparation mattered when I stood before Queen Seralia, knowing that my next words would not merely define my own fate, but could reverberate across systems, affecting billions of lives. The council nexus was resplendent in ceremonial light. Crystalline panels refracted the sun from Ceretha's distant star into intricate patterns, bathing the chamber in a mosaic of brilliance. Every counselor, advisor, and representative of human and Cerethian interests was present, their forms poised, expressions measured. I felt as though I were at the center of a universe-sized balance beam, where a single misstep could topple countless realities. Queen Seralia approached, her form shifting fluidly, radiating authority tempered with an almost imperceptible warmth. She did not speak first, yet I understood her expectations. This was my moment, my conscious, voluntary, informed decision, shaped by the weeks of cultural immersion, ethical debate, and shared intellectual rigor that had brought us to this precipice. I inhaled slowly, feeling the gravity of the covenant in my chest. My hand, which I had hoped to keep relaxed, trembled slightly, not out of fear but anticipation. I thought of humanity, of the trust placed in me, the bridges of diplomacy we had painstakingly constructed, the potential for misunderstanding or conflict. I thought of the Queen, her intelligence, her moral depth, her unwavering sense of responsibility. And I thought of myself, the human who had spoken a careless joke and now bore the consequences. My decision, I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside, is to honor the covenant, not out of coercion but out of understanding. Not because I must, but because I choose. A hush fell over the chamber. The Cerethian counselors inclined slightly, acknowledging the weight of a human acting with full comprehension and responsibility. The Queen's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, the chamber felt less like a tribunal, and more like a shared space of mutual recognition. "You understand what this entails?" the Queen asked. Her voice, serene and commanding, reverberated subtly through the chamber, emphasizing each word. "I do," I replied. "I understand the duties, the expectations, and the consequences. I understand potential risks to both my species and yours. And I understand the responsibility of trust, partnership, and mutual respect that this covenant requires." She extended her hand, not as a monarch enforcing obedience, but as a partner acknowledging choice. I took it, feeling the resonance of authority, intelligence, and unexpected intimacy. The gesture was simple, yet its significance was immeasurable. It formalized not only a political arrangement, but profound alignment of minds and, perhaps, hearts. The council convened, and the proceedings began with procedural precision. Legal codices were cited, precedents reviewed, and obligations enumerated. Earth's representatives submitted their commentary, noting the unprecedented nature of the human consent. Cerethian advisors responded with measured explanations of covenant law, cultural norms, and the binding nature of the spoken word. I observed, engaged, and occasionally contributed, ensuring that the human perspective was respected without undermining the integrity of Sarathian tradition. Hours passed, yet the process moved fluidly, each debate a dance of diplomacy, intellect, and moral reasoning. The Queen occasionally signaled subtly, guiding discussions with a light touch that only someone attuned to centuries of practice could wield. I marveled at her ability to command without coercion, to persuade without domination, and to navigate complexity with elegance and precision. Finally, the formal declaration was read aloud, reverberating to the chamber like a musical chord resonating in a cathedral. I was recognized as consort, advisor, and human representative within the covenant. The language was both legal and ceremonial, intertwining duties with ethical expectations, rights with obligations. The words fell heavier than any human contract I had signed, yet somehow lighter than fear, because they reflected a conscious, informed choice rather than a mere imposition. The Queen's eyes met mine, and in them I saw affirmation, curiosity, and a hint of something that transcended ceremony, trust, connection, and the faintest trace of mutual respect bordering on fondness. I realized at that moment that the journey that had begun with a careless joke had transformed into something profound, a partnership of intellect, morality, and shared responsibility. Outside the chamber, the counselors and representatives filed past, some bowing, some nodding, some silently acknowledging the unusual but deliberate alignment we had forged. I walked beside the Queen, our steps synchronized, our thoughts aligned in a way that defied words. The world or worlds remained unpredictable, yet in that precise moment, I felt equilibrium. Later, in the private chamber of the Queen, we stood in silence, observing the reflection of distant stars through the crystalline walls. No words were needed. The covenant was complete, the choice made, and the responsibilities accepted. And yet, the weight of reflection pressed gently on us both. "You understand the path ahead will be challenging," she said softly. "Not just politically, but personally. You will be scrutinized, tested, and perhaps even opposed. Yet you have chosen willingly. That is rare." "I understand," I replied, "and I am ready." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that conveyed approval, recognition, and a subtle warmth. "Then we begin together." And so we did. The ensuing weeks were a balance of duty and understanding, diplomacy and partnership, tension and connection. Every decision carried consequence. Every choice reflected not only law and tradition, but moral reasoning, ethical deliberation, and mutual respect. And within that balance, a subtle bond grew, one founded not on romance alone, nor duty alone, but on the shared commitment to comprehend, guide, and preserve. At last, I found a quiet moment, alone in the observation chamber. The stars stretched infinitely before me, each a distant sun, a potential home, a reminder of humanity's place in the universe. I reflected on the journey that had begun with a flippant remark, a careless joke that had irreversibly altered my life and the lives of those around me. And yet, in the midst of cosmic complexity, I understood a profound truth. Choice, integrity, and understanding were not bound by species, tradition, or culture. They were universal. I turned to look at the Queen, her form reflected in the crystalline panels. She was a study in balance. Authority tempered by curiosity, law tempered by empathy, power tempered by thoughtfulness. I realized that in her presence, I had been challenged, tested, and ultimately transformed. And perhaps she, in her own way, had been transformed as well. In the end, the covenant was more than law. It was not merely a bond between a human and an alien queen. It was a reflection of what could exist when intelligence, morality, and choice aligned across the vastness of space. It was proof that even amidst uncertainty, humor, and mistake, understanding could be forged, connections could emerge, and decisions could be made consciously, voluntarily, and with full awareness of consequence. I took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the universe and my place within it. Humanity was fragile, impulsive, and often flawed, but in this moment, I felt capable, aligned, and part of something far greater than myself. And as the stars stretched endlessly and the covenant settled into its rightful place in the interstellar order, I understood, finally and completely, choice defines us, power tests us, love transforms us. And the measure of humanity is not an avoidance of consequence, but in the courage to act wisely, morally, and consciously in the face of it.